If I say that a role-playing game has a system for narrative or social interaction, what does that make you think of? What sort of structure comes to mind? Do you imagine rolling a die and adding a bonus and comparing that to some static number to determine if you successfully convince the NPC of the truth? Or do you imagine that there are faction sheets where you're attempting to increase your rating with a certain faction? Or maybe you imagine that there's like a social duel system where you actually are in a fight of words. All of these come to mind when you think of such a structure, right? And I know that is an immediate turnoff for a lot of people when they look at a role-playing game. They want to leave the storytelling, the narrative, the socialization in the imagined space together, improvising and role-playing off one another, leaving that open rather than constrained by a system. But in today's video, I'd like to unpack how systems can mechanicize this ideologically, and why they can actually facilitate improvisation and storytelling. Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and this video is going to be on the concept of roleplay input versus roleplay output, and how that is represented in tabletop role-playing games. So let's dive in and I'll define some terms, and as always, we'll unpack this interesting subject on mechanicizing narrative. First, let's define roleplay output structures. This is a rule system or approach to play where a mechanic or die roll is what triggers you to roleplay or add something to the narrative based on the results of those mechanics or dice. And that sounds a little verbose, but when I give you some examples, this will seem very familiar. Let's say I'm playing some 5th edition D&D and it's my turn and I'm in a fight with some goblins. And I describe how my fighter runs up to the group of goblins and I pick up my sword and I swing it and I'm going to try to, decapitate the goblin or something. I then roll 1d20, add some bonuses, and if I succeed, I then roll maybe a 2d6 and add another bonus, and that damage is compared to the hit points of the goblin, and whether the goblin lives or dies is based on that result. And the Dungeon Master will then say if that was enough damage to kill the goblin. And maybe they'll add a bunch of descriptive details for me. They'll say, yeah, you run up and you take your sword and you just chop their head clean off and the head goes sailing through the air, blood spraying everywhere, all sorts of great gruesome details that are the result of the dice that I just rolled. Similarly, I could be standing at the doorway to a bandit hideout, trying to convince the guards to let me in through some elaborate lie. And I could be describing this to the DM and saying how I'd like to approach it, and then I pick up my dice and I roll a deception roll or performance or whatever the DM calls for, and based on that result, I either make it inside or not. And the Dungeon Master could describe how I totally convinced them and they weren't really paying close attention, so they totally buy my story, and we paint a picture together based on the results of those dice, adding to the canon and the narrative based on how the dice fell. You see, even though there are dice rolls involved both before and after in both of these previous cases, these are output role-playing structures because the dice are the operative part of that scene. The dice control success or failure, and we, the players at the DM, are narrating and role-playing surrounding it. And there's nothing wrong with this approach. However, I'm sure some of you watching are feeling a little abraded by that second example, where you're starting to feel like the dice should be doing less of the talking and the players at the table should be more engaged in building the world and telling its story and interacting with each other. And that's also totally understandable. And I think it's that ideology, this output role-playing, that turns people off from the idea of having mechanics around narrative, roleplay, and socialization, because that implementation just doesn't jive with a more story-first sort of approach, and it can feel restrictive, constraining on the storytelling at the table. But that's not the only ideology, the only approach to mechanicizing narrative or roleplay. There's the idea of input role-playing systems, and I'll unpack what that is now. An input role-playing structure is one in which the roleplay and narrative of the player is the operative part of the scene, and it then triggers a die roll or some sort of mechanic as a result of the storytelling, rather than the other way around. And one of the most clear examples of this ideology in practice comes from Powered by the Apocalypse games. Now, I had the absolute pleasure of playing some Brindlewood Bay with some other content creators. We didn't stream it or record or anything, it was just for fun, and it really clearly articulated to me this concept of roleplay input. You see, in Brindlewood Bay, you are playing old grannies in a New England town who are in a murder mystery book club, and you are trying to solve a mystery. It's absolutely lovely, and it's a very story-driven game, great for 1-shots or 3-shots and so forth, and I had an absolute blast. But there were particular systems in this game that were roleplay input that I'd like to highlight. In Brindlewood Bay, when you would fail any move, any roll, you can activate a flashback. You can tell a story, a bit of narrative detail about your character that maybe you didn't even know of ahead of time. You have to pick from a list, so it's constructed as a mechanic, but what you actually describe is up to you. Some of the examples are tell a story, a fond memory of your late husband, or a time when you weren't a perfect mother or daughter or spouse. And the actual details of that story are completely up to you. But you can only use each of those prompts once during a session, so it's encouraging you to keep being more and more creative and come up with more stories. And the game system doesn't rate your story. There's no roll to determine if your story was good enough or not. By simply participating in this improvisational moment, by adding to your character's story and engrossing the table in that story, you gain a mechanical benefit. But because the actual storytelling portion is not constrained, is not limited or rated or numerically represented, it remains a pure roleplay input structure. Because what you're putting into the engine of the game and into the rules of the game is a story, something you've told, a story that was prompted of you by the game. But what comes out are mechanics, structures, rules. But the operative portion here is that roleplay. And it's important to emphasize that this is purely improvisational in that it's not something I prepared for my character ahead of time. It's not part of my build. It's something that I'll need to come up with spontaneously and on the spot, a way to build more story into my character and for me to discover more about that character itself. And this is something that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do otherwise, or wouldn't have thought to ask. I would have never thought, okay, what's a specific fond memory about me and my late husband in this game? What a cool moment that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to have if the game system didn't ask it of me. Similarly, in Brindlewood Bay, at character creation, which you do at the table, the other players get to give you equipment. They get to describe what you would have in your cozy little home in Brindlewood Bay based on what they interpret about your character and their backstory. So these improvisational moments where they're coming up with what little doilies and doodads you might have can be relevant because everything in your cozy little home can be leveraged to assist in rolls, or help you recover, or have other game mechanic structures. But the game is asking the players to tell a story together about what this equipment might be. And because there's no discrete equipment list in the game. You're not having swords and armor or anything like that. It's, trophies from your late husband or a collection of knickknacks or stamps or something. But the game is asking you, the players, to engage in world building and instantiate mechanical benefit. Hence, input role-playing. And for my character, one of the other players gave me an old firearm. I had an old pistol that my late husband had, and it ended up becoming extremely relevant in the story. Of course, me, the cowboy guy, ended up with a gun. And in the climactic scene of the episode, somebody had taken a civilian hostage, and I actually got to pull out that gun that another player had given me and added to my own backstory to, wing the person with the knife, right, and save the day, like these classic Murder, She Wrote episodes. And that wouldn't have been possible without the game prompting us to build these additional backstory elements into each other's characters. And now, not every system is a hard line in either input or output structure. Like so many game systems, they're a spectrum. And the way I tend to run my games at home is a little bit of mix of the two. I like to have the players role play what they'd like to do, which I then contextualize into setting target numbers or difficulties or advantages. Then we do roll dice, and then at the end we also then instantiate that into the narrative. So I like to add it kind of at both ends because I'm a very middle of the road kind of guy. I expand on that subject a little bit more in a previous video I made with a horrendous thumbnail, and I'll put a link down below to that. It's about challenging the character versus challenging the player, but don't take these two ideologies as entirely separate. And now, as we often do on this channel, I'm going to take what we've just been talking about and show how I've applied that to my own game design journey on Tales from Elsewhere, because I think that showing these philosophies in practice, how I've applied them in my own way, is really useful for educational purposes. And as always, if what I'm going to be talking about here is interesting to you, there's going to be a link down below to places to download Quick Start guides, and if you're watching this around when it airs, there'll be a link to the Kickstarter pre-launch sign-up page for the actual print run of my Tales from Elsewhere Clockworld setting, but info on that down below. Let's talk about how I've used these ideologies to create my luck system in Tales from Elsewhere. The luck system in TFE is a minor narrative manipulation tool that the players have access to, and it's a way for them to both gain good luck and bad luck over the course of a session. This is represented by a little metacurrency, and they spend luck in order to manipulate their dice, re-roll a failed skill test, or re-roll the results of an injury roll to hope for something more severe. But they can also use it to make minor narrative adjustments, like remembering to bring a piece of gear they left back in town, or stumbling across something useful in this abandoned mine, like, hey, good thing there was a oil lantern they left in this mine because we all forgot our light sources. Little things like that. And that aspect of this system is a roleplay output structure. You're applying narrative changes mechanically, which you then instantiate into the canon, right? It's a game system that triggers some narrative result. But the roleplay input side is how you gain luck. You see, the way to gain luck is by adding, as a player, negative complications to the scene based on your backstory or personality traits, or just simply bad luck. For example, maybe during a key scene, that bounty hunter that's in your backstory that's always been after you finally shows up to take you in and collect that sweet, sweet reward, but he's done so at the worst possible time. That the player activates storytelling-wise, which then gets instantiated into the canon, and receives 1 luck for doing so. And this is a fully player-facing process. The players determine what these story elements will be that they'd like to add to the narrative. And the game prompts you to do this by having these backstory elements that have a lot of roleplay things tied to them. You could be a lawman from the big city who is on the run. And these things are cues to you as to how you can leverage this to have something bad happen to you. Combine that with your personality traits that you can also select during character creation, and it gives you a nice little roster, ammunition to use against yourself. A way to expand the story about your character negatively, because this is, after all, action horror. You see, it is squarely in the roleplay input structure because what triggers this, the way it works, is a narrative addition to the game. It is a moment of improv and storytelling that isn't rated as successful or not. You don't describe this and then roll something to determine if you gain the luck or not. You are adding to the story, making things harder on yourself, and gaining a metacurrency as a reward. Now, the system is still somewhat of a light touch when it comes to narrative systems, because really, at the end of the day, my preference is actually to leave a lot of narrative things open to what happens at the table and bring in the dice only as needed, but my game provides some mechanical support to that playstyle of letting the story come out a little bit more and rewarding the players for doing so, prompting them to engage in that manner. And I've found with my years of playtesting this system that the players that are optimizers, that are in it just for the mechanics and making cool character builds, it actually kind of prompts them to engage more in the storytelling as well, because they gain a powerful metacurrency for doing so. It's optimal for them to add story and add ramifications for their backstory into the game. And this is one of innumerable ways to tackle this same sort of design challenge. I definitely don't have the right solution or the only solution. It's just the one that I like for my game. And I totally understand those that want to leave all those mechanics out when it comes to their role-playing, their storytelling, their narrative, that what they have at their table is what the ideal already is for them. They've facilitated that storytelling and world building in a way that they don't need the dice or the systems to intrude. So something to consider, those of you watching at home. The table you have at home, the game you run, is not every table, and would not be easy to replicate with a different group of players, or with a different DM. These things can be tough to do, and it's the challenge of the game designer to attempt to create a structure that facilitates the type of gameplay, the table experience that they intend you to have, that the game is designed to do. And that can be tough if you leave it entirely open. It takes a very experienced GM to be able to do this effectively, and it's why there are so many wonderful videos out there providing advice and guidance as to do so, because doing so without guidance is actually quite challenging. And it's why I think games should include some sort of scaffolding, some way to prompt the GM and the players to get in there and build story, apart from just saying, here's an open canvas, paint on it. I want to thank you so much for watching, and this is something that I'm doing in my free time currently. I have a day job, and so any support you can provide is really meaningful. Liking, subscribing, commenting. And if you want to go to another level, we have a Patreon page where you can help support this channel and the creatives behind it. And most importantly, if you're watching this around the time it airs, we have a Kickstarter running. Either the pre-launch page or the Kickstarter itself will be live. Consider supporting us by checking out our game. There's also free playtest materials you can do to see what you'd be getting into before putting any money down. We'll put links to everything down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you here next week on Tales from Elsewhere.